What if the financial system you trust every single day was never designed to help you, but to hold you in place forever? What if the stability you believe in, the money you earn, save, and depend on, is actually part of a machine built centuries ago with one goal: to keep you paying, borrowing, and depending on a structure that you never chose? Most people think debt is an accident, a policy failure, a temporary imbalance that governments will eventually correct. But what if that belief is the real illusion? What if the pattern behind global finance is not chaos, but intention, repetition, and engineering refined across generations? Imagine this. Every empire, every banking reform, every crisis, and every recovery follows the same mysterious rhythm, as if guided by a blueprint hidden in plain sight. A blueprint designed not only to move wealth upward, but to ensure that once you step inside the monetary system, you never truly step out again. The mechanisms change, the institutions evolve, the faces shift, but the underlying structure continues its quiet work. And the more you look into it, the more you start to notice the same patterns resurfacing. Currency shifts, credit expansions, engineered scarcity, and cycles of controlled collapse that reshape economies while ordinary people fight to stay afloat. Why does this keep happening? Why do nations rise in prosperity only to find themselves drowning in obligations they can never repay? Why do individuals feel trapped in financial systems that promise opportunity yet deliver dependency? These aren't random outcomes. They're symptoms of a deeper architecture built long before any of us were born. An architecture that grows stronger the less people notice its walls. And as we unravel these layers, you might start recognizing moments in your own life where the system quietly tightened its grip. Maybe you felt it when interest rates shifted without warning, when prices rose but wages didn't, when your savings suddenly bought less, or when every solution offered by the system somehow led back to the same place. More debt, more pressure, more uncertainty. You already know this feeling. You just may not have realized it was designed. Before we go any deeper into how this machine was built, shaped, and perfected, take a moment to share what part of this resonates with you. Have you ever felt trapped by financial decisions that didn't feel like decisions at all? Comment your experience, hit the like button, so this message reaches others who need it, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next steps of this unfolding story, because what you're about to discover may change how you see money forever. And as we move forward, keep your attention sharp, because the next layer reveals how this structure began and why escaping it was never part of the plan. The origins of this monetary machine stretch back farther than most people realize, beginning at a moment when governments faced a crisis they couldn't escape with the tools they had. Picture a nation running out of money, terrified of losing its power, desperate to fund wars, expansion, and political ambitions. It was in this environment that the first blueprint for perpetual debt was quietly engineered, an arrangement so clever, so subtle, that even those who participated in it didn't fully understand what they were creating. This wasn't just financial innovation. It was the invention of a system designed to bind nations, citizens, and future generations to an obligation with no endpoint. At its core, the early architects discovered something transformative. Debt didn't need to be temporary. It didn't need to be paid back in full. It could be turned into a permanent engine, a source of endless revenue for those who controlled its flow. All they needed was a way to convince governments that constant borrowing was not only acceptable, but essential. And once that idea took root, money itself could be reshaped into something new, something that allowed power to grow without limit. The brilliance of the system began with the realization that governments could be compelled to rely on private lenders, and those lenders could secure their position indefinitely by structuring loans that never truly ended. Instead of repayment, governments would simply maintain the interest, a small cost at first glance, but one that multiplied across years until it became a fixed part of the national identity. This transformed public finance into a machine with predictable outputs, consistent interest payments, expanding debt, and a state permanently dependent on those who held its obligations. But the true innovation was not the loan itself. It was the creation of a new kind of money, money backed not by gold or goods, but by government promises. These promises became tradable, interchangeable, and eventually essential. As these instruments spread, they created an invisible network of dependency. Anyone holding them had a stake in maintaining the system. Anyone without them was left outside the flow of power. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shift occurred. Debt was no longer a burden to eliminate. It was the foundation of national strength, the backbone of economic growth, the justification for taxation, and the quiet mechanism through which wealth migrated upward. From this moment forward, states didn't just borrow to survive crises. They borrowed because the system demanded it. Every expansion of the monetary machine required more obligations, more promises, more trust in an architecture that never stopped growing. What began as a pragmatic solution evolved into a structural necessity, a self-sustaining system that pulled nations deeper each time they attempted to break free. And as this machine took shape, its influence extended beyond governments into markets, institutions, and the lives of ordinary people who would one day feel its consequences without ever seeing its design. As the foundations of the debt-based system solidified, something even more consequential began to unfold. What started as a national mechanism quietly expanded into an international web, stretching far beyond the borders of any single empire. Once governments realized they could monetize promises, the next logical step was to connect these promises across nations, creating a global marketplace where debt itself became a commodity. This was the moment when the machine evolved from a tool of survival into a mechanism of control. The shift didn't happen overnight. It unfolded gradually through wars, political alliances, and moments of crisis where nations needed money fast and lenders were ready to offer it at a price. Each transaction strengthened the architecture. Each loan tied one country's stability to another's decisions, and each bond issued brought new participants into a system that rewarded dependency and punished independence. Soon, debt was no longer a simple contract. It was a diplomatic instrument, a strategic weapon, a silent influence that reshaped the global order. Investors, banks, and governments began treating debt as if it were a universal language. It crossed borders with ease, bypassed culture, politics, and ideology. A bond issued in one capital could be traded in another before the ink on the original signature even dried. This interconnectedness was celebrated as a triumph of modern finance, but beneath the surface it created vulnerabilities that few understood. When obligations intertwine, failure in one part of the system threatens the stability of all others. And the architects of this era knew that once nations were tied together, none of them could afford for the machine to stop. As these instruments circulated, they accumulated power. They shaped markets, dictated interest rates, influenced elections, and determined whether countries rose or fell economically. But the most profound change was psychological. Governments began to fear default more than austerity, instability, or public anger. Default didn't just mean failure, it meant breaking the delicate chain that held the entire system together. And because that chain benefited those who controlled the flow of capital, every major power became invested in maintaining it. Yet what seemed like cooperation was actually entrapment. As global debt grew, each nation's freedom to maneuver shrank. Policy decisions were no longer shaped by long-term vision, but by the need to satisfy creditors. Economic planning gave way to short-term fixes that postponed real solutions. Sovereignty itself became conditional, determined not by constitutions or citizens, but by invisible financial pressures pushing governments in directions they didn't publicly acknowledge. By the time this network fully matured, it had become self-sustaining. Nations borrowed not because they needed to, but because the system required constant expansion. Debt became the bloodstream of the global economy, pumping endlessly through institutions that demanded more each year. And while this interconnected structure gave the appearance of stability, it masked a deeper truth. Every layer added made escape harder, and every crisis strengthened the machine that had quietly taken hold of the world. As this expanding web of obligations tightened around nations, a new generation of financial architects emerged, individuals and institutions who understood that controlling money was far more powerful than controlling territory. They didn't rule with armies or declarations. They shaped the world through mechanisms so subtle that most people never realized how deeply these structures influenced their lives. What they perfected was not simply lending, but engineering the very environment in which borrowing became inevitable. These architects recognized a simple but transformative truth. Whoever controls the terms of credit controls the future. And with that insight, they built systems that made debt not only unavoidable, but foundational. They introduced mechanisms that allowed governments to borrow endlessly without ever repaying the principal. They structured markets so that every crisis funneled nations back into the same cycle of dependence. And with each reinvention, they wrapped another layer around the global monetary machine, making it more complex, more resilient, and more difficult to challenge. Some refined the political dimension of finance, ensuring that governments could not function without constant injections of borrowed capital. Others expanded the reach of central banks, granting them authority over money creation itself. These institutions were framed as stabilizers, protectors of the economy, but beneath the veneer of neutrality lay extraordinary influence. By determining interest rates, liquidity levels, and credit conditions, they effectively dictated how nations operated, how markets behaved, and how societies evolved. And then there were the global financiers, the ones who learned how to transform government bonds into instruments traded across continents. They positioned themselves as indispensable intermediaries, the brokers of stability in a world increasingly dependent on financial flows. They weren't elected, yet their decisions shaped the destinies of millions. They weren't public servants, yet their influence reached deeper than most political leaders could ever hope to. Through them, Debt became not just a tool of governance, but a mechanism of hierarchy. What made the system so powerful was its invisibility. The architects didn't hide in the shadows. They operated in plain sight, celebrated as innovators, reformers, and builders of modern economies. Their work was framed as progress, even when it constrained entire nations. And because the mechanisms they created became essential to global stability, no country could easily challenge them without risking collapse. The machine they built doesn't rely on coercion. It relies on design. It doesn't force nations into dependence. It guides them there through incentives, expectations, and the quiet pressure of interconnected obligations. Over time, the architects faded into history, but their structures lived on, evolving with each generation, tightening as global finance grew more complex, and shaping a world where escaping the system became almost unimaginable. If you've ever felt that these patterns seem too coordinated to be accidental, share your thoughts below. What part of this hidden architecture stands out to you the most? By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, the monetary machine had become more than a framework for national finance. It had evolved into a geopolitical force capable of shaping the rise and fall of entire regions. Debt was no longer simply a mechanism of economic management. It had become a strategic instrument wielded by the most powerful nations and financial institutions. Through it, influence spread without. Armies, control deepened without occupation, and nations found themselves maneuvering within boundaries set not by ideology or territory, but by financial constraint. The world wars had left countries devastated and desperate for reconstruction. This desperation created an opening for the machine to expand, positioning its operators as saviors who would supply capital in exchange for long-term adherence to the system's rules. Institutions emerged claiming neutrality and global cooperation, but beneath their diplomatic language lay the same principles that had guided the early architects: perpetual debt, structural dependence, and the subtle transfer of power from elected governments to financial authorities. As developing nations sought to modernize, they borrowed heavily, believing these loans would provide the foundation for progress. At first, the influx of capital stimulated growth, created infrastructure, and instilled hope. But the optimism masked a deeper truth. The loans came with terms, conditions that dictated economic policy, trade decisions, and domestic programs. These conditions weren't merely guidelines, they were levers of control. Nations that accepted them found their political options narrowing, their sovereignty diluted by obligations that extended far beyond their borders. When these countries struggled to repay, the machine did not pause. Instead, it adapted. Debt was restructured, extended, and multiplied. The original obligations never disappeared. They transformed into new ones, often larger and more binding. What seemed like relief was actually reinforcement. Each restructuring pushed countries deeper into reliance, ensuring that the machine's influence remained intact. Meanwhile, powerful nations used the structure to maintain dominance. They financed allies, pressured adversaries, and shaped global markets through bond purchases, currency policies, and interest rate decisions. Every action created ripples that tied the world more tightly together, turning the financial system into a complex web where a crisis in one region threatened stability everywhere else. This interdependence was celebrated as global cooperation, but it functioned more like a labyrinth. Once inside, there was no clear exit. The genius of this era wasn't just the spread of debt, it was the normalization of it. Borrowing became synonymous with progress, deficits with modern governance, and reliance on financial institutions with responsible leadership. These narratives ensured that even critics struggled to imagine alternatives. The machine had become so embedded in the global order that challenging it felt like risking collapse itself. And as this mindset solidified, the line between economic policy and geopolitical strategy blurred, allowing debt to operate as the most powerful geopolitical tool of the age. As the 20th century gave way to the modern era, the monetary machine no longer influenced economies from a distance. It became embedded in the daily reality of ordinary citizens. What had once been a geopolitical tool now extended its reach into personal decisions, shaping how individuals lived, worked, planned, and struggled. The system had evolved into something more intimate, more pervasive, and far more difficult to recognize. It no longer needed grand policies to exert control. It operated through the quiet logic of everyday financial life. Wages stagnated while the cost of living rose, pushing people toward credit, not as a choice, but as a necessity. Mortgages, student loans, medical bills, credit cards, each one presented as a personal opportunity, yet all functioning as extensions of a vast structure that demanded constant repayment. Debt became the silent companion of adulthood, normalized to the point where living without it seemed irresponsible or even impossible. The system didn't enforce compliance by force. It encouraged it through expectation, culture, and the illusion of empowerment. Governments reinforced this shift by promoting consumption as the engine of national prosperity. When growth slowed, interest rates dropped to stimulate borrowing. When crises hit, new lending programs were introduced to keep money flowing. Each solution led to more dependence, more leverage, and more citizens tied to obligations that outlived their financial stability. In this environment, personal debt mirrored national debt, perpetual, expanding, and treated as the natural condition of modern life. What made this shift so transformative was the way it altered perception. People began to see debt not as a burden, but as a tool, a gateway to opportunity. Yet behind this narrative lay a deeper transformation. Individuals were becoming the raw material that kept the machine running. Their payments fed institutions, their interest sustained markets, and their continued borrowing justified the system's expansion. The structure no longer relied solely on governments. It fed on households, on workers, on anyone seeking a better future through financial means. At the same time, technological advances allowed the system to operate with unprecedented precision. Algorithms assessed risk, credit scores determined access, and automated markets reacted instantly to global changes. The machine was no longer merely mechanical. It was intelligent, adaptive, capable of reinforcing behaviors that kept citizens engaged and indebted. This evolution didn't just maintain the system, it accelerated it. By now, the separation between national obligation and personal finance had dissolved. The citizen was no longer just a participant in the economic system. They had become an essential component of its survival. Their aspirations, fears, and vulnerabilities had been woven into a structure that promised mobility while quietly tightening its grip. And as this transformation unfolded, a new layer of the machine began to reveal itself, one that operated not only through economics but through psychology, expectation, and the subtle pressure of a world built on promises that could never fully be fulfilled. As individuals became essential components of the monetary machine, another transformation quietly unfolded, one that revealed just how deeply the system had embedded itself into the very structure of modern life. The machine no longer depended solely on government decisions, institutional policies, or global markets. It had developed internal mechanisms that allowed it to grow, adapt, and sustain itself almost as if it were alive. These mechanisms formed a self-reinforcing cycle, one that ensured the system remained dominant regardless of political shifts, economic crises, or public resistance. The first of these mechanisms was expectation. Entire societies were built around assumptions that constant growth was normal, that rising prices were inevitable, and that expanding debt was simply part of progress. These beliefs weren't imposed. They were absorbed gradually, generation and after generation, until they became indistinguishable from common sense. Once expectations aligned with the machine's logic, the system no longer needed persuasion. It only needed repetition. Another mechanism was normalization. As debt became the backbone of modern economies, institutions reshaped their operations to match. Corporations relied on borrowing to expand. Households relied on credit to survive. Governments relied on deficits to function. This normalization ensured that any disruption to the machine would threaten the stability of everything built on top of it. In a world structured around debt, challenging the system meant challenging the foundation of society itself. But perhaps the most powerful mechanism was reinforcement. Each crisis that should have weakened the system ended up strengthening it instead. Recessions triggered stimulus programs. Market crashes led to bailouts and liquidity injections. Every shock produced more borrowing, more dependence, and more justification for the machine's expansion. The system learned to turn instability into opportunity, transforming threats into fuel. This resilience created an illusion of permanence. People began to treat the machine as unbreakable, as if it were the natural state of modern civilization. Yet beneath that illusion lay a more unsettling truth. The machine survived not because it was perfect, but because it was deeply entangled with the very structure of our lives. Unwinding it would require entire societies to rethink what money is, what progress means, and how value is created, changes that few were prepared to consider. And so the machine continued to evolve, tightening its hold through layers of expectations, norms, and responses that shaped behavior long before anyone realized what was happening. It didn't need to force compliance, it only needed to guide choices. It didn't need to threaten, it merely needed to offer pathways that all pointed in the same direction. Over time, these hidden gears ensured that participation wasn't optional, it was inevitable. If any part of this feels familiar or hits close to home, share your thoughts in the comments. What mechanism do you think has the strongest grip on people today? As the internal mechanisms of the monetary machine strengthened, another layer of the system became impossible to ignore: the illusion at the center of modern finance. It is the belief that money represents something concrete, something measurable, something grounded in real value. Yet, in truth, the foundation of global currency has drifted far from anything tangible. What people hold, earn, save, and chase is no longer backed by the physical world, but by confidence, expectation, and a perpetual cycle of promises that can never fully be honored. This illusion began subtly with the gradual detachment of money from commodities, but its consequences became clearer as financial systems expanded. Once currencies floated freely, once governments could issue money based solely on policy needs rather than material reserves, the machine gained near unlimited room to grow. Every expansion of credit, every easing of monetary policy, every injection of liquidity pushed society deeper into a realm where value was defined not by scarcity or labor, but by a collective belief that the system would hold. Yet this transition came with a hidden cost. As money became abstract, the obligations tied to it became unbounded. Nations began operating with debts so large they could never be repaid in real terms. Individuals carried obligations that stretched decades into the future. Corporations relied on perpetual refinancing to stay afloat. And the system, unable to function without constant expansion, required more borrowing, always more, to prevent collapse. What appeared to be flexibility was actually dependency disguised as freedom. The brilliance of this illusion is that it functions smoothly as long as people never question its core assumptions. As long as currencies circulate, as long as markets respond predictably, as long as institutions maintain the appearance of control, the machine continues without interruption. But the system's stability is more fragile than it seems. Every crisis reveals how quickly confidence can evaporate, how markets can seize, currencies can fall, and governments can scramble to restore order through measures that only deepen the underlying problem. Despite this fragility, the machine persists because the alternative feels unthinkable. To question the illusion at the heart of money is to question the structure of modern life itself. And so societies adapt. People accept inflation as normal. They treat rising debt as unavoidable. They view financial instability as temporary rather than structural. Each belief reinforces the system, strengthening an architecture that depends on its participants, never fully understanding how it operates. What remains concealed is that the system cannot return to a world of tangible value or finite constraints, not without unraveling the very mechanisms that keep it alive. The illusion is both its shield and its prison. And as long as the world continues to rely on a promise-based currency, the machine will expand, absorbing every crisis and converting each new challenge into justification for its own survival. As the illusion of modern money solidified, its effects began to carve themselves into the lived reality of entire populations. The machine was no longer an abstract structure operating above society. It became a force shaping the rhythm of ordinary life. People grew up inside an economic architecture designed long before they were born, inheriting expectations they never questioned because those expectations felt natural. Work hard, earn more, take on debt if necessary, stay productive, keep moving. These guiding principles became so deeply embedded that few ever stopped to ask who benefited from this constant motion. Generations came to believe that upward mobility depended on entering the system early and staying inside it indefinitely. Students borrowed heavily with the hope of securing a future that was becoming increasingly inaccessible. Families purchased homes with mortgages structured to last most of a lifetime. Workers tied their stability to companies that themselves relied on debt to function. The individual's ambition, once a symbol of freedom, quietly transformed into a point of leverage that the machine could pull whenever expansion slowed. But the personal dimension ran deeper than financial obligations. The psychological weight of debt created a new form of pressure, an undercurrent of anxiety that shaped decisions about careers, relationships, and long-term plans. People delayed families because of loans. They stayed in jobs they disliked because they couldn't risk instability. They accepted rising costs and stagnant wages because the alternative felt like stepping outside the only structure they'd ever known. These trade-offs weren't imposed by law. They were shaped by a set of economic conditions that favored dependence over autonomy. At the national level, the impact was just as profound. Countries burdened by massive public debt hesitated to invest in their citizens, choosing instead to prioritize financial obligations. Social programs shrank, public infrastructure decayed, and economic opportunity became concentrated among those already positioned to take advantage of the system's design. Meanwhile, financial institutions continued to accumulate wealth, not through innovation or production, but through interest, fees, and the mechanisms that kept money circulating on their terms. Each crisis amplified these inequalities. As markets collapsed and governments scrambled to respond, those closest to the machine recovered quickly, while ordinary people bore the long-term consequences. Savings evaporated, wages lagged behind inflation, and entire communities struggled to rebuild while financial markets soared again. The disconnect between lived experience and official narratives deepened, revealing a world where resilience was unevenly distributed and vulnerability was deliberately structured. By the time people realized how much influence the machine exerted over their choices, they were already woven into its logic. Their goals, fears, and expectations had been shaped by a system that depended on their participation to survive. And as the pressure mounted, it became clear that the human cost of the machine was not an accident. It was a byproduct of a design that prioritized stability for the system over stability for the individual. As the human cost of this vast monetary machine continued to grow, its final layer began to reveal itself, the part that is rarely acknowledged yet silently dictates the trajectory of entire nations. The deepest truth is that the system was never designed to resolve itself. It was designed to perpetuate motion, feeding on expansion, absorbing shocks, and converting every obstacle into another reason to grow. And now, after centuries of refinement, the machine has reached a point where it no longer reacts to crises. It anticipates them, depends on them, and uses them to justify its evolution. Each new phase of instability creates an opening for more intervention, more liquidity, more restructuring. It is a cycle that appears chaotic on the surface, yet underneath follows a logic as consistent as clockwork. When currencies weaken, new policies emerge. When markets tremble, emergency measures become the norm. When societies struggle, temporary programs turn permanent. All of it pushing the system forward, deeper into a state where nothing can be allowed to contract. Not debt, not markets, not expectations. Growth becomes obligation, and the world becomes conditioned to chase a horizon that always moves just out of reach. But this momentum carries consequences. As obligations multiply, the machine demands increasing levels of coordination between governments, central banks, and global institutions. Decisions that once reflected national interests now reflect the needs of a system too interconnected to fail. And in this interconnectedness, a new kind of vulnerability emerges. The realization that if one pillar falls, the entire structure shakes. Nations that once believed they controlled their financial destiny now find themselves adjusting policies not to serve their people, but to preserve the architecture that binds them. For individuals, this creates an invisible tension, an awareness that the future feels uncertain, not because of personal choices, but because the world itself seems guided by forces beyond their reach. People sense that something is shifting, that the ground beneath them is moving faster than they can follow. They see prices rising, savings eroding, and institutions struggling to maintain the appearance of stability. And even if they cannot articulate it fully, they feel the weight of a system approaching a point where it may need to transform in ways no one has prepared for. Yet within this uncertainty, there is also clarity. Understanding the machine, how it works, why it persists, and what it demands, allows people to see beyond the surface narrative and recognize the patterns shaping their lives. And once you see those patterns, you can never unsee them. You start questioning what you once accepted. You start noticing what others overlook. And you begin to understand why the next chapter of this story may determine not just the future of economies, but the future of how societies function at their core. If you stayed with me until now, let me know in the comments with a simple phrase like, "I'm here until the end, so I know you're someone who sees the deeper layers." And if this journey opened your eyes or connected with you in any way, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Your support helps me keep building these investigations. And before you go, tap the like button. It tells me you want more content that goes beyond the surface. There's another video right here that expands on everything we've uncovered. Click it, continue with me there,